Hello everybody, welcome to episode 95 of Short Viewer. Today we'll be going over A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Now, I'll actually first show off the cover I have here. This is the Arcturus Classics cover. Well, it's Arcturus. It's labeled as Arcturus Classics, but this is just a common Arcturus cover. So yeah, you got that there. Nice spine. I really like the colors on this. But yeah. So, this book, I believe it was about 364 pages with the Arcturus edition, and it was very good. Like, I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did when I went into it. But I guess I'll just kind of get into the story here briefly. So, the story starts off in a very confusing manner. Like, it took a bit for me to actually, like, kind of understand what was going on. But we're introduced to the character of Mr. Lorry, or, his name's, why am I blanking here? It's not Jeremy. Well, we're just going to call him Mr. Lorry. But yeah, so Mr. Lorry, we're introduced to the character of Mr. Lorry, and Mr. Lorry works at a place called Tellson's Bank, and this place is in England. But yeah, so we're introduced to this, and then ultimately we see as Mr. Lorry kind of conspires with this young girl who has a missing father to go actually find and rejoin with him. So he ultimately ends up taking her to France, where she goes to Saint Antoine or Antoine or something like that. I don't speak French. Which is a suburb, and she goes over there and ultimately finds her father, who is like disheveled, just making shoes, who even though he's not a shoemaker, and he's just kind of going about his thing. And ultimately they're able to bring him back and break him out of this horrible stint that he's in. But yeah, so during this, they ultimately end up going back to England, and we're also introduced to the character of Defarge. Now, I'm just calling him Mr. and Miss Defarge because, I mean, it's not Jacques, his name actually isn't Jacques, but, I'm just going to call him Mr. and Mrs. Defarge. But, yeah. So, Defarges are a married couple who run a wine shop in Saint Antoine, and this is where they actually found the disheveled father, because this dude who was there was kind of just watching over him and helping him all that. But, yeah, so ultimately they end up going back to England, and we see that, like I said, the father is still alive, and he actually is able to break out of this, and we learn that he is actually a doctor by practice. And through all this, we kind of see is him. So I'll just tell you his name. His name is Alexandre Manette, and his daughter's name is Lucy Manette. And so they just kind of start kicking it off, slowly developing and learning more about like each other, because their racial relationship had been cut off because of something we learned a little bit later on. I'll tell you now. He had been imprisoned in the Bastille, and he'd been so for, I believe, almost, it was over 10 years. It was either 10 years or 16 years, because I know when a point later on in the book happens, he says he's been in there for almost his 10th year. So he was in the Bastille for a very long time, and this is why he becomes so disheveled, because he had lost his mind and went crazy while in the Bastille, which was just a big prison in France. But yeah, so we see this, and they ultimately end up attending a trial. And this trial is of a young man by the name of Charles Darnay. Now, Charles Darnay is on trial for treason, because he has come to England from France on a boat, and the Manettes are here because they were with him on that boat, and then Mr. Lorry, and like I said, the Manettes and Mr. Lorry were on the boat with him when he was coming over, and they were just kind of attributing to his character. And ultimately, which was a surprising verdict, Charles ends up getting off scot-free. He does not end up actually going to prison. Or actually not going to prison. The punishment for treason was death, and he does not actually end up dying. Yeah, so after this, we are introduced to the characters of Mr. Stryver, who really isn't very important throughout all the story, so we probably won't mention him later on, and Sidney Carton, who is very important to the story, who has, when he first meets up with Charles Darnay, he mentions that they have a lot of similarities, and he kind of reminds him of him when he was a little bit younger, and how they actually do resemble each other physically quite a bit as well. But yeah, so after this, we get to see as a couple of years, some time passes, and we see that everyone's kind of just going about their lives, and many of the people are starting to try and court Lucy. And it's really only Mr. Stryver, Carton, and Darnay, and we just kind of see all this play out, and ultimately, we see Stryver ends up talking with Carton. He's like, yeah, I'm going to propose to Sidney one day. Not Sidney, Sidney's Carton. We're going to propose to Lucy one day. And Carton kind of, I guess, admits kind of a distaste for Lucy's physical appearance and how he's not actually attracted to her, even though I don't really know what the point of that was, because he ultimately does prove that he does feel love for her, just not romantic love later on. Just care for her family and all that. But yeah, so we see this, but we also see as Charles goes to Alexander Manette, or Mr. Manette, Dr. Manette's what he's called usually, And he goes and talks with him, and he admits how he is deeply in love with Lucy and that he wants to hopefully marry her someday and go on to have a family with her. And him and Mr. Manette are talking about this, and everything's going well and all that. And they ultimately end up discussing, and at one point, Charles is like, okay, I'm going to ask for her hand in marriage, and then he offers his full name. And this is kind of odd because we don't know much about Darnay at the moment. But yeah, he offers to Dr. Manette to, I guess, reveal to him his own name, and Dr. Manette's like, yo, I don't really want that unless I ask it of you, so don't worry about it. So yeah, we get to see this. Also, during that period before this happened, we got to see as Darnay actually goes back to France. Now, Charles Darnay is a French native, and he is a part of a very, not really, they're kind of like outcasts of the aristocratic society in France. They're the Evremonds, and they are just a group of, I guess, a family who has a big chateau and all of that. They're just a part of the aristocracy. Yeah, so we see as Charles actually goes back here, but his reasoning for going back here was to assassinate, or not really assassinate, but have his uncle, the Marquis, killed, which ultimately ends up happening, and he goes back to France. And we see that as they briefly talked, because they met up and actually talked for a little bit, that Charles did have distaste for the Marquis, but the Marquis is ultimately killed, and he's going back. And a man by the name of Gabelle, or Gabelle, so I'm going to say Gable or Gabelle, so I'm just going to presume it's Gabelle, is left in charge of the manse and all that, while Charles Darnay, the actual heir to it, is kind of going back to England. He's abandoning his post because he doesn't want that. He doesn't want to live the aristocratic lifestyle. There we are, buddy. But yeah, so he does not want to live this lifestyle. So he goes back to England, falls in love with Lucy, and then asks Alexandra for his daughter's hand in marriage. So ultimately, they end up doing this. Actually, there's another event between this, so I'll discuss that one. But we see throughout all of this as we also get introduced to Mr. Cruncher, who is his name is he is Jerry Cruncher. Yeah, Jerry Cruncher. And he's honestly probably one of my favorite characters in this book because he's just really goofy besides Charles, because Charles is honestly a really cool character as well. But yeah, so we get to see him, and he just kind of goes around doing odd jobs for Mr. Lorry and stuff like that. He has a grave digging side job. But yeah, so we just got introduced to him and all of that. And you get introduced to Mrs. Cruncher, who's a flopper and highly religious, and Mr. Cruncher can't stand that. But yeah, so we see as this progresses along, and we actually get to go for another perspective in France again, or Paris, because this is a tale of two cities. And, but yeah. So we see as in Paris, the Defarges are actually becoming a revolutionary group in a way. They hold revolutionary ideas, and Mr. Defarge is actually going about and speaking with members known as Jacks, who are also holding similar sentiments and all of that, and we see as the idea of revolution slowly progresses and develops. But yeah, so after that, we then end up going back to England, where we see as Charles and Lucy are ultimately married, and it's all happy and all of that. We see as they go to their own home, everything's joyous, everyone's having a blast. But during all of this, Alexander gets put under a lot of mental stress, and he snaps back into doing his shoemaker job, even though he has been a doctor here in England for multiple years now. And everyone is really concerned by this. Miss Pross, who is their house servant in the Manette household, and Mr. Lorry are freaking out about it, and he remains in this state for about 9 days. And ultimately, he ends up breaking out, and then Mr. Lorry confronts Dr. Manette, but he does it in a very smart way. He brings it in the idea of a close friend of his has the exact same symptoms as what Mr. Manette did, or Dr. Manette. And he discusses it with him. He tries to figure out a way to, I guess, solve the problem of Manette's kind of PTSD in this time span, and they briefly discuss it and all of that. Yeah, so then after that, we end up going along a little bit more to the year of 1784. Now, if you know anything about history, not 1784, 1789, my bad. So, if you know anything about history, you know that in 1789, the big French event happened. July 14th, 1789 was Bastille Day. But during it, we get some brief explanation of what happened during this time. We see as Lucy and Charles have actually started to build their family. They have a young daughter by the name of Lucy, just like their mother. So, who I'll call Little Lucy, but Little Lucy actually doesn't play that much of a role in the story. But yeah, so we see this, and we also see as Charles gets a letter actually, we get a view of the Bastille first. We get to see as Defarge and his wife actually push into the Bastille and all of that. They're kind of leading the charge, especially his wife, who becomes like a fanatic, but also like a high leader within the Revolution and the Republic. And she goes about and is helping like raid it and all of that. And we get to actually see a first-person perspective of the raid on the Bastille, which is really cool. Well, not the first-person perspective, but a cool like putting ourselves in the Bastille raid, which is really cool. I really enjoyed that because the Bastille and the French Revolution is one of my favorite events in all of history to study and learn about. So yeah, that was really cool. But we see that, and then we see as Charles receives a letter from Gabelle, and Gabelle is like, "Yo, I'm in trouble since I am perceived as an aristocrat, and I can't be up here. I need your help, and I need you to help me get out of this predicament I'm in." So Charles ultimately ends up discussing. And he goes and talks to Mr. Lorry, and Mr. Lorry's like, "No, I'll go do this myself." But Charles like, I can't do that. So he lies to Lorry and says, "Yeah, I'm going to stay here in England." But then he ultimately ends up going to France, and he leaves a letter behind for Lucy and the rest of the family. So he ends up going to France, and ultimately he arrives at the chateau, but he can't find Gabelle anywhere. And he is ultimately accosted by some revolutionaries, and they charge him with the crime of being an immigrant. So he is put in prison, in the prison of La Force. And after this, we see as Lucy and them all get the letter, and they ultimately end up running to France as well. So Dr. Manette, Mr. Lorry, Miss Pross, Cruncher, who comes along with Lorry to help him, because Cruncher was already going to go to France. He was already on his way to France, while Charles was. So he's already headed over there. But now we see as the Manettes and Miss Pross head over there as well. So they head over to essentially help out with Charles and help him get out of prison, since he has got himself in this pickle. And we actually see that we actually learn here that the Manettes are French natives who had moved to England after just some trouble with Dr. Manette getting in prison and all that. And obviously Lucy and her mother had lived in England for a while and been watched over by Mr. Lorry and all that stuff. And so we end up seeing, and we also get to see as Sidney Carton comes along with them as well. But we see here that Dr. Manette has a big following behind him in this area, because they remember him as the renowned doctor who was going about and helping everyone during that time. And he is also perceived as the renowned doctor who was in the Bastille, imprisoned by the aristocrats, because that is who put him in prison, was the aristocracy, which we'll learn more about later. Yeah, so he's loved among the revolution. They love him. He has much sway. And this ultimately ends up helping a lot with the trial of Charles, because Charles ends up going along, getting tried, and we see, due to Mr. Manette's help and everything, that he is ultimately let off. And this is really good. I mean, that was a lot of narrowing down for what really happened, but like there was a lot of cool dialogue. It was a very tense court scene. It was really enjoyable, and I loved it all around. Like this arc where they actually like get to Paris after the marriage of Lucy and Charles, and like the time skip all the way to the Bastille, is probably like my favorite part of the book. Like the last 100 or so pages, like 150 pages of this book are creme de la creme. They're good. But yeah, so we see as ultimately Charles is let off and is not actually sent to the guillotine or la guillotine for his crimes of being an immigrant. So we see ultimately as he goes, regroups with Lucy and little Lucy, and they kind of have a heartwarming gathering and all of that, until ultimately they end up popping back in and retaking Charles, because he has been charged again of another crime. And so they take him back, and he's confused because like he doesn't even know what he's been charged for, and what he has been charged for actually isn't revealed until we get to the second trial. What we see is Dr. Manette's trying to go around all that and like figure it out once again, because everyone's obviously distraught, because the man who was just let off at a very rare, I guess, moment of amnesty from a essential death penalty is now being sent back into that, and likely has very low odds of coming back out of it. But yeah, we learn ultimately that once it gets to the trial and all that, we see is everyone trying to freaking out, trying to get their stuff together so they can help try and save Charles again. We see ultimately it gets to the second trial, and we learn that Charles has been accused of being an aristocrat, which obviously we didn't. Well, most of the people didn't know, but after having learned more about him, they realized that he's an Evermond, and they he reveals himself as an Evermond when he first gets to France, and in his second trial, they remember that, the Evermonds are aristocrats, so he has been charged for being an aristocrat, and he is charged by 3 people, Mr. Defarge, and Dr. Manette. I legit thought this was like top 10 anime betrayals of all like time. I was like, what? Dr. Manette? This is his father-in-law. I was absolutely like flabbergasted. I did not expect that at all. I was like, what did Dr. Manette do? And we ultimately get this explained while the court proceedings occur. And so as Charles is on trial, we see as a letter is brought forward. Now, this letter was found by Mr. Defarge while he was running the Bastille, because we actually see as he went up to the area, because he knew about Dr. Manette, because he had helped harbor him and helped with his shoe business while he had been in distraught before Lucy and Mr. Laurie had come over to save him. And so he knows about this, and he knows that he was referred to himself as like 105 upper or something like that, because that's all he could remember, because that was his cell number. So Defarge went up there and helped figure out, wanted to look around and all that stuff, and ultimately he ends up finding a letter. Now, this letter enclosed in it a tale of what Dr. Manette once did and what essentially got him arrested. So at one point he was just traveling on a road. This was many, many years ago, and he was accosted by two aristocratic men. They ended up taking him to a place where there's a woman who is going through like a lot of just like a psychotic fit. She's thrashing about, doing all that. She's counting to 12, saying like brother, son, father, and going hush, and then just keeps repeating it. So she's obviously going through a psychotic event. And they don't really have much medicine to help her with it, but they do have some. So Dr. Manette administers this medicine. And they also then go up to the brothers doing, they're like, yo, we got another patient. So they take him over to this kid who is bleeding to death. Well, not kid, but he's a man who is, they describe him as being a handsome visage and all of that. And they end up going over, this man has been stabbed. And it's by a sword wound. And he's been laying here bleeding for a while, so Manette can't really do anything to save him. But during this man speaks to him, he explains why this woman and him are here. So what had happened was him and his sister, who we learned is his sister, have been of essentially peasant class their entire life. And during this, these two aristocrats saw the dude's sister as comely and was like, you know what, we're going to take her. So they ultimately end up taking her from her husband and having their way with her. That's why she's going through the psychotic event. And so, because of this, her brother was obviously dishonored and outraged, so he ends up going and trying to save her. And he challenges one of the brothers to a duel, which he ultimately loses and gets stabbed through. Now, he just kind of discusses this, and he also mentions one key point that he has a little sister who is living as well. And they just kind of discuss briefly, and ultimately the dude ends up putting a blood curse on them by making like a cross in blood out like before them. And ultimately, we see as everything kind of ends, they both end up dying, and the brothers are like, yo, Dr. Manette, this is something that you see but don't speak of, so don't go you ratting on us. But Dr. Manette ultimately returns to his normal life, but he cannot allow himself to remain quiet about this. His conscience is weighing too heavily on him. So ultimately he ends up sending a letter and reporting these two men for what they have done of sexual assault and murder. Technically the murder was in self-defense, but it's still murder. But yeah, so he ends up reporting this, and he just kind of goes about his life for a little bit. He ends up actually meeting with the wife of one of the brothers, who's actually an Evermond. And we see she brings her son, who is Charles, to speak with these brothers and all of that. Now, if you remember back, the uncle of Charles was the one who was the owner of the Evermond estate at the time. So we know that Charles' father is dead, and therefore the father, who is now dead, was one of the brothers, and obviously the uncle who was killed by Charles Darnay's antics was a brother as well. But yeah, so we see this, and she just kind of comes to and apologizes to Manette and all of that, and really just kind of wants to, I guess, free herself of any guilt or culpability with this. But yeah, so we see this progress out a little bit more, and ultimately, one day Manette's going about his thing, and he is captured again. And we see as he's kind of beat up and all of that, and we see as the brothers actually come back, and the brothers reveal to him that they had his letter. They got his letter because he was ratted on by the people he had ratted to. And this ultimately leads to Manette being sent to the Bastille, where, like I said, he stays for over 10 years and slowly loses his mind. But during all of this, we had seen that, when the mother came, the Evermond mother came and spoke with Dr. Manette, she mentioned about how she would want little Charles to be raised by the remaining sister, or go to the remaining sister, if anything bad were to happen. But yeah, so we see this, and they kind of talk, and ultimately we go back to the trial, where we learn that, in fact, Miss Defarge is that little sister, and that is why she has accused Evermond of this and seeks the death penalty for him, because her brother and sister were assaulted and murdered by these Evermonds, so she wants her vengeance. Yeah, so we see this, and ultimately Charles is sentenced to death. And this all leads to a big hoopla, tragedy. Obviously, everyone's sad. Lucy faints and everything. And we see as Dr. Manette kind of starts crumbling apart, though he doesn't actually break back into his PTSD episodes where he believes he's a shoemaker. But yeah, so this moves along, and ultimately we see as everyone's trying to conspire about what to do with Charles. We see actually as Madame Miss Defarge ends up going to, or trying to go to, the Manette place where they're staying in Paris, because she wants to get Lucy as well. She wants to get Lucy to, slip up against the Republic, commit treason, and therefore get sentenced to death as well, because she believes that all of the Evermond relations should fall because the Evermonds did such horrible things to her family. But yeah, so we see this, and we also get to see that a plan has been set about by Mr. Lorry and Sidney Carton. Now, ultimately, Sidney ends up, this is actually a little bit, we see a brief interaction between Miss Pross and Mr. Cruncher. We get like a little arc with them, and this is prior to like the trial and all that, but we see as they end up going to like a bar or somewhere, I don't remember exactly what it was, a restaurant, something like that, and they run into this dude who is actually Miss Pross's brother, and his actual name is John Solomon, but he is a spy by the name of Barsad, and we actually get to see as Barsad interacted with the Defarges way early on in the book when they were first like getting a little bit revolutionary. And Barsad obviously is a notorious spy, and he reveals to Miss Pross, to not be revealed, that he could get into the prison if they needed him to, just to not reveal his identity. And so this all ultimately ends up playing out, and we see as it's arranged for Barsad to get Sidney Carton into the prison, and they end up actually changing places. He ends up changing places with Charles Darnay and sacrificing himself to instead go to the guillotine rather than Charles, because Charles has a life, he has a family, and Sidney doesn't really have that. He just wants he has a cousin who lives in poverty, and he wants her to be, I don't know if it's a her or a he, but he just wants them to be in good standing, and this is why he is dying for the need of the Republic, because he believes that under the Republic that his cousin in poverty can thrive and be a little bit less poor. So we see this, ultimately Charles is allowed to escape, and we see as everyone else is kind of trying to flee. Well, already Lucy and little Lucy have got away, Mr. Lorry has gotten away, and Mr. Cruncher and Miss Pross are actually trying to get away. However, we see as Miss Pross ends up going back to the Manette place, where she is just like kind of looking around, making sure everything's okay, make sure everyone's gone. When she gets there, she's confronted by Miss Defarge, and Miss Defarge and her have like a brief interaction. They get all like mad at each other, and then we see as Miss Pross accidentally kills Miss Defarge, and she runs away. She's like just filled with guilt. She ends up throwing away the key to the Manette place, so they can't actually get in, and everything ultimately ends up with her leaving with Mr. Cruncher. But yeah, so we see as everyone is kind of free, and we actually get to see some of the last parts of the book as Carton goes to his death. And during this, he's on like a little cart, and he ends up speaking with this girl that he finds. And she's talking with him, and she realizes that because she was in the prison with Charles when he was in La Force, and she is talking with Carton, and she's like, "You're not the same person. You swapped out." So she recognizes him as a brave man. She's like, "I want to hold your hand and go along with this together." So they just kind of talk briefly and all of that, and ultimately they get to the guillotine, or the gallows essentially, but not the gallows. And they're just kind of talking, and ultimately they end up parting ways with a kiss. And Carton ends up heading up to the guillotine, where obviously Madame Defarge is not there yet, but the Vengeance, which is another woman, and everyone else is there and prepared. Ultimately, Carton is put into the guillotine and slice. Now, after this, we get a brief mention, a brief excerpt about like what Charles' like statements would have been. Hold up, yeah, and we just kind of like give some stuff, like some little background information. And I just want to read you this passage. I just really enjoyed this, but yeah, it states. If he had been given an utterance to his, and they were prophetic, they would have been these. I see Barsad and Cly, Defarge, the Vengeance, the Juryman, the Judge, long ranks of the new oppressors who have risen on the destruction of the old, perishing by this retributive instrument, before it shall cease out of its present use. I see a beautiful city and a brilliant people rising from this abyss, and in their struggles to be truly free, in their triumphs and defeats, Through long years to come, I see the evil of this time and of the previous time, of which this is the natural birth, gradually making expiation for itself and wearing out. I see the lives for which I laid down my life, peaceful, useful, prosperous, and happy, in that England which I shall no more see. I see her with a child upon her bosom who bears my name. I see her father, aged and bent, but otherwise restored and faithful to all men in his healing office, and at peace. I see the good old man, so long their friend, in 10 years' time, enriching them with all he has, and passing tranquilly to his reward. I see that I hold a sanctuary in their hearts and in the hearts of their descendants generations hence. I see her, an old woman, weeping for me on the anniversary of this day. I see her and her husband, their course done, lying side by side in their last earthly bed, and I know that each was not more honored and held sacred in the other's soul, and that I was in the souls of both. I see that child who lay upon her bosom and bore my name, a man winning his way up in that path of life which once was mine. I see him winning it so well that my name is made illustrious there by the light of his. I see the blot I threw upon it, and it faded away. I see him, foremost of just judges and honored men, bringing a boy of my name, with a forehead that I know and golden hair, to this place, then fair to look upon, and with not a trace of this day's disfigurement. And I hear him tell the child my story with a tender and faltering voice. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is far, far better. It is a far, far better rest than I go to than I have ever known. That was a beautiful way to end a book. I loved that. And like I said, that really ends A Tale of Two Cities. I loved this book, especially how it ended. I believe that, honestly, I've not read any Dickens, but I probably will be reading more Dickens, because that was a beautiful way to end a story. And I just love, like, everything about the end. Like I said, the last 160 pages of it are peak literature. I loved it so much. But yeah, that's all there really is, kind of just a brief, not really cohesive breakdown of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Like I said, I highly recommend this book. You don't have to have any prior reading to read it. It's just a really good book, especially with the political intrigue of it, and especially if you really enjoyed the French Revolution and learning about it. This does provide an exaggerated viewpoint of it. However, I do highly recommend reading it because it's just really good kind of introspection into the French Revolution. But yeah, like I said, that's all I really have about A Tale of Two Cities, and all I really have for episode 95 of Show For You. So thank you very much for watching.